The air inside Fairchild Manor carried the stale weight of old money and older secrets. A bitter wind rattled the grand estate's windows, but inside all was still. Too still. The body of Lady Eleanor Fairchild lay slumped in an ornate chair. By the hearth, her lifeless fingers curled around the stem of a delicate wineglass. The embers in the fireplace flickered, casting eerie shadows against the panelled walls. What should have been an ordinary evening at home had turned into an inexplicable tragedy. Inspector Arthur Graves examined the scene with growing unease. The lady of the house had been discovered by her maid, Lucy Trent, when she came in to clear away the supper tray. According to the maid's frantic account, Lady Fairchild had been perfectly fine when she left the room an hour prior. Now she was dead, her face frozen in an expression of mild surprise. No signs of forced entry. No indication of a struggle. No visible wounds. Just an elderly woman found dead in her own chair, a half-drunk glass of wine at her side. "It must be poison," murmured Graves, straightening up and meeting the gaze of Dr. Howard, the physician, who had been summoned in haste. The doctor, a portly man with thinning hair, stroked his chin. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but no immediate signs, no discoloration of the lips, no unusual scent from the glass. We'll know more after a proper examination." Graves turned to Lucy. The maid was still trembling, wringing her hands together. "You were the last to see her alive?" he asked. She nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. She was in good spirits when I left her. Reading a letter, I think. There was an envelope on the table." Graves scanned the room. Sure enough, an opened envelope lay on a polished side table, the letter itself nowhere in sight. He picked it up. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. "Did she receive any visitors tonight?" Graves pressed. "No, sir. Just me and Mr. Ellis." "Ellis? The butler, sir. He brought her the wine." Graves's gaze darkened. "Fetch him at once." Ellis arrived within minutes, an older man with a stiff posture and deeply lined face. "I served Lady Fairchild her usual wine at precisely 8 o'clock, he stated, voice steady but impassive. "She had one glass, as always." "No one else entered the room?" "No one, sir." The problem was maddening. If Lady Fairchild had been poisoned, how had it happened? The wine bottle in the decanter was untouched, and Ellis swore it had been poured directly from it. If someone had tampered with the drink, how had they done so under the butler's watchful eye? And then there was the missing letter. "Inspector." Graves was about to question Ellis further when the front doors opened, bringing a fresh gust of cold air into the manor. The small, elderly woman who entered seemed wholly unaffected by the dark atmosphere. Jane Marple, her keen eyes scanning the hallway, removed her gloves with deliberate care. "I received your message, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "A most curious case, I gather." Graves, having worked with Miss Marple before, simply nodded. "Too curious for my liking. A death with no apparent cause, no break-in, a letter that has vanished." Miss Marple tutted softly. "I should very much like to see the scene." Inside the study, she moved with a quiet attentiveness, absorbing every detail. She studied the way Lady Fairchild sat, the position of the wineglass, the placement of the envelope. After a moment, she walked to the hearth and peered into the dying embers. "Fascinating," she murmured. Graves crossed his arms. "You see something I don't?" "Oh, Inspector, you see everything," Miss Marple said kindly. "Only sometimes things are not quite what they seem." She turned her attention to Lucy, who still lingered near the door. "My dear, You said Lady Fairchild was reading a letter when you last saw her. Yes, ma'am. Miss Marple's gaze flicked back to the fireplace. Then I suspect the letter is no longer missing. Graves's brow furrowed, but he followed her line of thought. Stepping forward, he used the fire poker to sift through the ashes until he found what remained of burnt paper, its edges blackened, but some letters still faintly visible. Someone destroyed it, he muttered. Miss Marple clasped her hands. Indeed, the question is, who and why? Graves turned to Ellis. Was the fire burning when you left Lady Fairchild? Ellis hesitated. No, sir. It had been dying down for hours. Graves's eyes narrowed. Then someone added fuel to it after her death. Miss Marple smiled gently. Precisely. And that, Inspector, tells us that someone was in this room after Lady Fairchild died. And more than that, it suggests she read something that alarmed her. Graves exhaled slowly. The crime had seemed impossible, a death with no cause, but now it was clear that something much darker was at play. And Miss Marple, as always, had seen the first thread that would unravel the mystery. Miss Marple moved closer to the hearth, peering at the charred remnants of the letter. Her expression remained pleasant, but there was a keen sharpness in her gaze, a quiet certainty that had unsettled many a criminal in the past. She reached out and picked up a slender brass poker, gently nudging a few fragments of burned paper aside. A few letters were still discernible among the ashes. Hatefully yours, and let me warn. Inspector Graves crouched beside her, frowning. A warning? Someone wrote to Lady Fairchild about a danger she was facing. It would seem so, Miss Marple replied, brushing a bit of dust from her glove. Though whether the warning came too late or was heeded, at all remains a mystery. She turned back toward the others in the room, her gaze lingering thoughtfully on Lucy Trent, the maid. The young woman stood stiffly, hands still nervously clasped. Her eyes darted toward the fireplace every so often, as if unwillingly drawn to it. Lucy, my dear, did Lady Fairchild seem distressed when you last saw her? Lucy hesitated. I don't know if I'd say distressed, ma'am. She seemed preoccupied, not quite herself. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with something between sympathy and curiosity. Preoccupied, and yet she still asked for her usual glass of wine. Lucy nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Ellis brought it in, just as always. Miss Marple turned her attention to the butler. Mr. Ellis, you have served in this house for many years, haven't you? Yes, madam, nearly 30. His voice carried the weight of duty and discretion, but there was a stiffness about his posture that did not go unnoticed. And did Lady Fairchild ever change her routine? Even slightly? Ellis shook his head. She was a woman of habit. Ma'am, every evening she read in her chair with a glass of port before retiring. She rarely deviated. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, yes, a comforting routine. And yet, tonight something was different, wasn't it? The butler's face remained unreadable, but there was a slight tension in his jaw. Graves, impatient, with the line of questioning, interjected. Different how, Miss Marple? She gestured lightly toward the small side table next to Lady Fairchild's chair. There's only one glass here, Inspector. Graves raised an eyebrow. And, Miss Marple sighed gently, if Lady Fairchild drank port every night, it would have been poured into one of the small, rounded glasses from her usual set, would it not? This glass is taller, thinner, a wine glass, not one for port. Ellis visibly stiffened. She insisted on the wine this evening, he said quickly. Said she fancied a change. How unusual, Miss Marple murmured. After so many years of routine, a sudden preference for wine instead of port. And you said you poured it yourself? Ellis hesitated for just a moment too long. Yes. Graves stepped forward. You're certain, Ellis? You took the bottle from the decanter and poured it in front of her? I did. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. Curious, because there's something else that doesn't quite fit. She gestured toward the wine bottle still sitting in the decanter. Graves picked it up, uncorked it, and sniffed. It's unopened. His voice was flat, edged with suspicion. Miss Marple clasped her hands together. Indeed. And yet, Ellis, you said you poured her wine directly from the bottle this evening. The butler paled. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Graves loomed closer. Well? Ellis swallowed hard. I don't know what to say, sir. He hesitated, then sighed heavily. I lied. I didn't pour the wine myself. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but there was a knowing glint in her eyes. Then who did? Ellis hesitated again before glancing toward Lucy. The young maid flinched as if struck. Graves turned sharply. Lucy, she took a shaky breath. I brought in the glass. I didn't think it was important. Her voice quivered. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. Then tell us everything, my dear. No detail is too small. Lucy wrung her hands. I came to clear the supper tray as usual, but just before I left, she stopped me. She asked me to fetch a glass of wine from the kitchen, said she wanted something lighter than her usual port. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So you went to the kitchen and poured it yourself? Lucy nodded. Yes, ma'am. And you took the wine from the bottle in the decanter? Yes, no. She faltered, eyes darting to Ellis. I mean, the bottle wasn't there. I thought it had already been taken to the study, so I checked the smaller wine cupboard in the kitchen. Miss Marple and Graves exchanged a glance. Graves's voice was sharp. You're saying the bottle from the decanter wasn't in the kitchen? Lucy shook her head. No, sir, I couldn't find it. Graves exhaled through his nose. So the glass Lady Fairchild drank from didn't come from the decanter at all. It came from a different bottle entirely. Miss Marple gave a small nod. And a different bottle, Inspector, means a different possibility altogether. Graves turned back to Lucy. And where is that bottle now? Lucy's lips parted, but she suddenly froze. A look of horror crossed her face. I don't know. I left it in the kitchen. It should still be there. Graves spun to one of the constables, standing by the door. Check the kitchen. Find that bottle. The officer hurried out. Silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Miss Marple, however, seemed lost in thought. After a few moments, she walked slowly toward Lady Fairchild's chair and glanced down at the glass still resting beside the body. Then she turned toward Ellis. Mr. Ellis, did Lady Fairchild receive visitors often? The butler, clearly rattled, shook his head. Not many, no. And in the last week? Ellis's mouth opened, then closed again. He hesitated, eyes flickering toward the maid. Miss Marple pressed gently. It's all right, Ellis. The truth, if you please. He swallowed hard. A gentleman came 2 nights ago. Graves stiffened. A gentleman. Ellis nodded reluctantly. "A Mr. Dunwich. She met with him privately. I was asked not to disturb them." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And after his visit, did Lady Fairchild seem changed?" Alice nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. She seemed troubled, distracted." Graves frowned. "And you didn't think to mention this sooner?" Alice's gaze fell. I didn't think it was relevant." Just then the constable rushed back into the room, his expression grim. "The bottle's gone, sir." Graves swore under his breath. Miss Marple, however, merely smiled. "Now, Inspector, I do believe we have a most intriguing puzzle indeed. A vanished bottle, a secret visitor, and a lady who changed her routine for the first time in years. Wouldn't you say the pieces are beginning to align?" Graves scowled. "They might be, but we still don't know what it all means." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Not yet, dear Inspector, but we will." Inspector Graves turned to Ellis and Lucy, his sharp gaze scrutinizing them both. "A bottle doesn't just vanish," he said coldly. "Someone removed it. Someone who had a reason." Lucy swallowed hard, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "I swear, sir, I left it in the kitchen. It was just an ordinary bottle of red." Miss Marple's gentle voice interrupted her. "Oh, but it wasn't, was it?" She smiled, kindly, but her eyes held a knowing glint. "It wasn't ordinary at all." Lucy's lips parted, but she hesitated. Graves stepped in, his tone less forgiving. "If you know something, now's the time to speak up." The young maid's hands shook as she pressed them to her chest. It was already open," she admitted in a whisper. I thought nothing of it at the time, but the cork was loose. I assumed someone had taken a glass earlier." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Very observant, my dear. And tell me, did Lady Fairchild say anything when you brought her the wine?" Lucy blinked. Rapidly. "No, ma'am, just thank you, dear, as always." Ellis shifted beside her, his stiff posture betraying discomfort. Miss Marple noticed and turned to him. "Mr. Ellis, you were responsible for the household's wine, were you not?" The butler cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you would know what was in the decanter at all times." Ellis hesitated just a second too long before nodding. "Yes, of course." "And yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "when Lucy couldn't find the usual bottle, you said nothing." Ellis's hands clenched at his sides. I assumed she had found an acceptable substitute. I saw no reason to question it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet, here we are." Graves exhaled sharply. "Enough of this dodging, Ellis. When was the last time you saw the missing bottle?" Ellis's eyes darted toward the door. "This morning," he admitted. "It was in the decanter, as always." Graves narrowed his gaze. "And after that?" The butler's mouth pressed into a thin line. I don't know." Miss Marple observed the way his fingers twitched slightly as he spoke. A nervous tick. He knew something, but he wasn't ready to say it. Graves wasn't in the mood for patience. "I'll be frank, Ellis. The way I see it, either you're hiding something, or you were careless. Either way, I'm not convinced you're telling." "Us everything," Ellis bristled. "I have served this family faithfully for decades, Inspector." Graves's voice was firm. "Then honor that service by telling us the truth." Ellis hesitated again, then exhaled heavily. "I didn't see who took the bottle," he admitted, his voice quieter. "But I know it wasn't Lady Fairchild." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Which means someone else had access." Ellis nodded stiffly. Yes. Graves exhaled through his nose. We need to speak to the rest of the household. A short time later, the remaining staff gathered in the drawing room. Cook, an older woman with a perpetual frown. James, the young footman, and Margaret, Lady Fairchild's long-time companion. Each had been roused from their evening routines, and each displayed varying degrees of unease. Graves stepped forward. We need to know who entered the kitchen today, and more importantly, who could have taken that bottle of wine. Cook folded her arms. Only the usual, sir. Myself, Lucy, and James. James, a nervous lad with a pale complexion, nodded quickly. I never touched the wine, sir, I swear it. Miss Marple studied him carefully. And did you see anyone else near the kitchen this evening? James hesitated, then nodded. Mr. Dunwich was there, ma'am. Graves stiffened. Dunwich? James swallowed. Yes, sir. He arrived in the afternoon. I thought it strange since he wasn't announced, but Lady Fairchild let him in herself. Graves turned to Ellis. You said he visited 2 nights ago. Ellis nodded gravely. That's correct, sir. Miss Marple's lips pursed. And now he's returned. Uninvited, I suspect. Ellis hesitated. Yes, ma'am. Cook snorted. Of course it was uninvited. Her ladyship didn't like that man. I heard her say so. Graves crossed his arms. Yet she let him in. Cook huffed. Because she was too polite to refuse him outright, I imagine. Miss Marple glanced at Ellis. Tell me, Mr. Ellis, when he visited before, did you overhear anything? Ellis hesitated. No, ma'am. But when he left, Lady Fairchild was terribly upset. Graves frowned. What did she say? Ellis looked uncomfortable. She told me to lock the doors early. Said she didn't want any more disturbances. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. And yet he returned. Graves turned back to James. Where was Dunwich when you saw him in the kitchen? James looked unsure. By the pantry, sir. He looked like he was searching for something. Graves's eyes darkened. Did you speak to him? James shook his head. No, sir, he didn't see me. Miss Marple tapped a finger against her chin. Fascinating. The room fell silent. The implication was clear. Mr. Dunwich had entered the house uninvited, loitered near the kitchen, and had very possibly taken the missing bottle. Graves clenched his jaw. We need to find Dunwich. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and when we do, I believe we'll have some very important questions for him. The air in the drawing room felt heavier now, thick with the weight of secrets not yet spoken. Miss Marple sat primly in a high-backed chair, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her gaze moving thoughtfully from one face to the next. Inspector Graves, by contrast, stood with his arms crossed, exuding the kind of barely restrained impatience that made criminals nervous and innocent men feel guilty. James, the footman, had paled noticeably since mentioning Dunwich's unannounced visit. I didn't want to say anything before, he mumbled, shifting uneasily under Graves's scrutiny. I thought I might get in trouble for not alerting Mr. Ellis right away. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh, my dear boy, the truth is always better told sooner rather than later, and I dare say it may help us untangle a rather difficult matter. Graves grunted. Difficult is an understatement. We have a vanished bottle of wine, a dead woman, and a man lurking about uninvited. It's beginning to look rather clear, if you ask me. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Is it, Inspector? I do wonder, he sighed. You think Dunwich isn't our man? Oh, I have no doubt that Mr. Dunwich's presence here is highly suspicious, she admitted, but suspicion alone does not make a murderer. Graves frowned but said nothing. Miss Marple turned back to Ellis. Tell me, Mr. Ellis, what do you know of this Dunwich? The butler hesitated, adjusting his cuffs before answering. Not much, ma'am. He came to see Lady Fairchild twice in the last few days. The first time they spoke privately for nearly an hour. I was not privy to the conversation, but afterward, Lady Fairchild seemed greatly troubled. Graves's expression darkened. And the second time, Ellis's throat worked as he swallowed. I never saw him leave. Silence spread through the room like a ripple on still water. Graves straightened. What do you mean? Ellis exhaled slowly. I saw him enter through the front doors. He did not leave by them. Miss Marple tilted her head, which means he may still have been inside the house when Lady Fairchild met her end. A flicker of something crossed Ellis's face. Unease, perhaps. That is my concern, ma'am. Graves huffed, clearly frustrated. It's clear as day, isn't it? He's the one who wanted her dead. A nephew denied his inheritance would have no qualms about ending a relative's life to get what he thinks he's owed. I'm not so sure, Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze lingering on the paper in her hands. Sometimes, Inspector, people act in strange ways when they're desperate. Graves shot her a sharp glance. You've seen enough to know this isn't desperation. This is cold, calculated greed. Miss Marple folded the letter neatly, placing it on the side table. That may be true, or it may not be. But there's something about this letter that feels too clean, too obvious. Graves scowled, frustrated by the vagueness of her response. So now we wait? Let him walk right into our hands? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. I'm afraid it's not that simple. The following day, the authorities quickly assembled to confront Victor Fairchild as he arrived at the estate. The solicitor was present alongside an anxious staff, and a brief, tense meeting was arranged in the library. Graves watched as the young man entered with an air of detachment, his demeanor as cold as the winter sky outside. I assume you know why we've gathered you here, Mr. Fairchild, Graves said curtly, his voice hard with suspicion. Victor's face remained impassive. I'm here because of my late aunt's will, Inspector, and I would like to speak to her solicitor regarding the details. The inspector stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You're also here because of her sudden death, are you? Not. You've been away for weeks, but now, when you stand to inherit everything, you reappear without a care in the world. Victor raised an eyebrow, his lips twisting into a tight smile. You're mistaken, Inspector. I wasn't trying to avoid anything. I simply had business to attend to in London, and now that I'm back, I intend to ensure my aunt's wishes are followed. Graves crossed his arms. You're the sole heir, I presume? Victor nodded curtly. That's correct. So it must have been quite the shock to hear that you were cut from her will, wasn't it? For the briefest moment, something flickered in Victor's eyes, a mixture of guilt and resentment. I was, he said, his voice lowering. But she had her reasons, and as much as I disagreed with them, I wasn't going to argue with her final decision. Graves's eyes narrowed, as though trying to read the man's soul. So you were willing to walk away from your inheritance without protest, Victor? Met his gaze without flinching. Yes. But Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room, spoke then, her voice steady and sure. "And yet, Mr. Fairchild, when you heard of your aunt's death, you didn't appear heartbroken. You didn't seem eager to mourn." Victor's gaze shifted toward her. "I have no obligation to explain my grief to anyone." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But one might expect a bit more emotion from a man who claims to have cared about his aunt, especially given the fact that your absence from the estate only deepened the mystery of her death." Victor stiffened, but then a cold smile curled his lips. "I didn't need to be here to know what happened. My aunt's death was likely a tragic accident." At that moment, Graves' eyes gleamed with triumph. "We've found the poison that killed her, you know. It was in the wine, right from the bottle." Victor's eyes momentarily widened. "What? But you didn't know that, did you?" Graves continued, leaning forward. "A bottle of wine you could have taken from the kitchen. Or perhaps you were the one who put it there." Victor's hand twitched involuntarily, but he quickly regained his composure. "I had no reason to—" "That's enough, Mr. Fairchild," Graves interrupted sharply. "We have everything we need. You killed her for the inheritance, didn't you? You poisoned her wine, and then—" But before Graves could continue, Miss Marple raised a hand, her soft voice cutting through the tension. "I'm afraid you're jumping to conclusions, Inspector." Graves turned to her, visibly taken aback. "What? Are you telling me we're wrong?" "I'm telling you that you've found a convenient piece of evidence, but it doesn't tell the whole story, Miss," Marple said quietly. Graves blinked, momentarily speechless. "What are you saying, Miss Marple? We have him right here." Miss Marple stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "I said that you found a piece of evidence, Inspector, and I'm afraid it's too convenient to be the breakthrough you think it is." Victor's expression darkened as he took a step back, as though finally realizing that the net wasn't as tight as it had seemed. Graves frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's eyes met his with calm certainty. "I mean this letter from Mr. Fairchild, the one that seemed to bring him conveniently back into the picture. It's too perfect. A man suddenly shows up, just when the investigation turns its focus to him. How much more convenient could that be?" Victor took a deep breath but said nothing. "I suspect," Miss Marple continued, her gaze sweeping over the room, "that the letter was a red herring planted deliberately to throw us off track. Someone wanted to make it appear as though Mr. Fairchild was our obvious culprit." Graves stared at her, the realization dawning slowly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And I believe the true murderer is still hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment to strike again." The room had fallen unnervingly silent after Miss Marple's words, as though the weight of her statement was sinking in. Graves, still frowning, shifted his gaze from her to the men standing around, a shadow of doubt crossing his mind. It was clear he wasn't ready to let go of the case so easily. "So you're saying this letter was planted, and we're looking in the wrong direction entirely?" Miss Marple's eyes were focused, unyielding. "Not wrong, just incomplete. The clues, Inspector, are more complex than you imagine." Victor Fairchild, now visibly agitated, took a small step backward, his earlier composure faltering. "What are you insinuating, Miss Marple?" His voice, cool but tinged with tension, betrayed the concern beginning to gnaw at him. "Oh, I'm not insinuating anything, Mr. Fairchild. Not at this point," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But there is something we must consider. The past. Sometimes it's what has been forgotten or overlooked that can bring us closer to the truth. Graves crossed his arms, eyeing her with increasing skepticism. The past, eh? You think this is some old grudge resurfacing? You're not suggesting someone's holding a centuries-old vendetta, are you? She smiled slightly. Not centuries, no, but I do think there are old connections that have been buried, connections that might explain why this crime feels so deliberate. She turned toward the window, her gaze distant for a moment. You see, this isn't the first time the Fairchild family has faced tragedy. The mention of past tragedy seemed to hang in the air. Graves, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Miss Marple's voice softened as she began to unfold a story, one she had picked up from whispers and rumors long forgotten, by most, but not by the observant. Lady Fairchild's family, and particularly her brother, once found themselves embroiled in a scandal that almost ruined them. He was a gambler, you see, and his debts were enormous. He ended up losing everything, his fortune, his reputation, and he died under mysterious circumstances. Victor straightened, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. That's ancient history. My mother and aunt chose to move on from that. His tone was sharp, but there was an underlying defensiveness that betrayed the unease he was trying so hard to suppress. I don't think they ever truly moved on, Mr. Fairchild, Miss Marple countered gently. And I think it's more than coincidence that you, her nephew, suddenly reappeared when your aunt was murdered. You see, your family's history, tragic as it may be, is important. Graves was beginning to see where Miss Marple was going with this, but he wasn't quite ready to let go of his theory. So, you're telling me this is all connected to some old gambling debt? We've seen no evidence of that, Miss Marple. No, not directly, but I do believe we've overlooked a crucial piece, she said, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Lady Fairchild's brother, the late Mr. Edward Fairchild, had a partner in his gambling days, a man named John Dunwich, The mention of the name, both Victor and Graves stiffened. Miss Marple saw it immediately. The very name that had seemed like a mere footnote to this investigation now appeared in a different light. Dunwich. The name echoed in the quiet room, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw a crack in the otherwise confident demeanour of Victor. Fairchild. Dunwich, Victor repeated, his voice suddenly lower than before. That's impossible. My uncle died long before I even knew of him. Miss Marple smiled knowingly. Indeed, Mr. Fairchild, but it seems that his debts weren't the only thing that remained behind. His old partner, Mr. John Dunwich, has been much closer to your family than you realize. She turned toward the others, her gaze sweeping over them as she explained. What you don't know, Inspector, is that Mr. Dunwich didn't simply vanish after the debts were paid. He stayed on. He became involved in various aspects of the family's business, watching from the shadows, but always there, waiting. Graves let out a slow breath, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So, you're saying Dunwich had a hand in both the old debts and the current situation? Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And it's no coincidence that he showed up again now. Dunwich has been keeping an eye on Lady Fairchild's will, biding his time, the same way he did all those years ago. Victor's face had paled, and he opened his mouth, as though trying to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Graves shifted uncomfortably. But we have nothing to link him to the murder. He could have just shown up because he wanted to make sure he was compensated. Compensated Miss Marple's tone held a note of quiet amusement. "Mr. Fairchild, you still don't see it, do you? Dunwich wasn't interested in Lady Fairchild's charity or her money. He had another reason to return. He was looking for something far more precious. Control." Victor shot a glance at the door, then back at Miss Marple. "Control? Of what?" "Of everything," she answered quietly. "Of her estate, her business dealings, her legacy. Your aunt had wealth. Yes, but she also had something that Dunwich needed, her approval, her trust. All this time, he had been working to get closer to her, hoping to gain control in some way." Miss Marple's eyes held a quiet, knowing gaze. But when the will was altered, when he realized he would not be inheriting anything, he took matters into his own hands. He knew that your aunt's death would leave everything in limbo, and he could seize the opportunity. Victor's eyes narrowed, and though his lips moved, the words didn't quite reach his mouth. He was trying to piece things together, but still struggling with the truth. Graves's voice was gruff as he spoke, though it lacked his usual certainty. "So we're looking for a man who's been hiding in plain sight all these years?" "Not hiding," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Just waiting." Victor turned to leave, his face a mask of confusion, but Miss Marple's words stopped him. "Mr. Fairchild, the man you've been so eager to protect isn't your uncle's business partner as you thought. He is the one who killed your aunt, and now he'll try to cover his tracks just as he did back then." For the first time, Victor faltered. His own family history, now painfully exposed, seemed to unravel before him. The days following Miss Marple's revelation had not been kind to the Fairchild estate. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with suspicion and fear. Despite their knowledge that John Dunwich was somehow entangled in the dark history of the family, the pieces of the puzzle remained frustratingly out of reach. He hadn't yet made an appearance, and the authorities, in their haste to wrap things up, had turned their attention to Victor Fairchild, who was growing increasingly agitated and desperate to maintain his innocence. But Miss Marple was not one to rush to conclusions. She had seen many cases where the obvious suspect was merely a decoy, a part of a much larger game being played beneath the surface. And so she waited, observing, allowing the threads of the mystery to slowly unravel. She had her suspicions, but she wasn't going to reveal them until she had absolute certainty. It was one particular evening, a few days after Victor's arrival back at the estate, that Miss Marple decided it was time for an unconventional approach. She had noticed something small, something easily overlooked during her interactions with the suspects, the way people reacted when their assumptions were challenged. It was in the library once again that Miss Marple found herself alone with Victor Fairchild. He was seated in an armchair, nervously tapping his fingers on the wooden armrest, his gaze shifting around the room as though trying to evade some invisible force. Graves had left to follow up on an unrelated lead, and the time seemed ripe for Miss Marple to test her theory. "Mr. Fairchild," Miss Marple began, her voice calm and soothing, "there's something I would like to ask you." Victor glanced up, his face slightly pale. "What is it now, Miss Marple? Haven't we been through enough of this already?" She smiled gently, as though her questions were the most natural thing in the world. "I believe you know the person who killed your aunt." His eyes widened, and he instinctively leaned forward, his hands trembling. "What? What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing dramatic," she replied with a quiet chuckle. "I just thought you might want to give a few more details, perhaps to show your sincerity." She leaned back, waiting for him to respond. Victor's throat constricted, and his mouth opened and closed, as though searching for the right words. You think what? That I had a part in this? His voice cracked slightly, and he quickly cleared his throat. I've already told you everything, Miss Marple. I don't know anything about the murder. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowed in thought. But you do know something, don't you, Mr. Fairchild? Victor's hands clenched into fists. I don't know what you're talking about. I've told you everything I know. Everything. His voice rose, a slight panic creeping into his words. I'm not the murderer. You have no right to accuse me like this. Miss Marple observed him with the keenest of eyes, watching as his usual composure began to crack under the pressure. His anger was a response to something deeper, something she had yet to uncover. She smiled faintly to herself, recognizing the subtle tremor in his voice, the crack in his carefully constructed façade. I'm not accusing you, Mr. Fairchild, she said in a measured tone. I simply wanted to see how you would respond. Victor took a deep, shaky breath, trying to regain control of himself. I told you the truth. You have to believe me. Miss Marple's smile remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. I do believe you, but I think there's something you're not telling me. She paused for a moment, watching his reaction carefully. What did you know about John Dunwich before your aunt's death? What kind of man was he to you? The question hit its mark. Victor's eyes flashed, a mixture of anger and fear crossing his face. His hands trembled again, but this time he didn't try to hide it. His eyes darted to the door, as though considering an escape. I've already told you, Victor muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was nothing to me, just a name from my family's past. I didn't even know he was involved with my aunt until all this started. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft yet probing. But you must have known something. People don't simply return from the past without reason, and I believe you knew exactly why he was here. Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. I don't know anything about that. You don't understand. You don't know what it was like. She kept things from me. She kept everything from me. His breath quickened, and his eyes grew wild. I was never part of her plans. Never part of anything. It was in that moment that Miss Marple knew she had found the crack she had been waiting for. The moment Victor's voice had broken, the moment his carefully controlled façade had shattered, she knew the truth was close. It wasn't just his own feelings of being left out that had him so upset. It was the guilt, the knowledge that Dunwich's reappearance had thrown a wrench into his plans to secure what he believed should be rightfully his. Tell me, Mr. Fairchild, Miss Marple asked, her voice still steady. When did you last speak to your aunt before her death? Victor hesitated, his eyes flickering as though trying to remember something. I don't remember. It was the day before it happened. She had just finished dinner, and I asked her if I could look over some of the papers. In her office. I wanted to make sure everything was in order, you know. But she wouldn't let me in. She said she had already made her decisions. It was one particular evening, a few days after Victor's arrival back at the estate, that Miss Marple decided it was time for an unconventional approach. She had noticed something small, something easily overlooked during her interactions with the suspects, the way people reacted when their assumptions were challenged. It was in the library once again that Miss Marple found herself alone with Victor Fairchild. He was seated in an armchair, nervously tapping his fingers on the wooden armrest, his gaze shifting around the room as though trying to evade some invisible force. Graves had left to follow up on an unrelated lead, and the time seemed ripe for Miss Marple to test her theory. "Mr. Fairchild," Miss Marple began, her voice calm and soothing, "there's something I would like to ask you." Victor glanced up, his face slightly pale. "What is it now, Miss Marple? Haven't we been through enough of this already?" She smiled gently, as though her questions were the most natural thing in the world. "I believe you know the person who killed your aunt." His eyes widened, and he instinctively leaned forward, his hands trembling. What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing dramatic," she replied with a quiet chuckle. "I just thought you might want to give a few more details, perhaps to show your sincerity." She leaned back, waiting for him to respond. Victor's throat constricted, and his mouth opened and closed, as though searching for the right words. You think What? That I had a part in this?" His voice cracked slightly, and he quickly cleared his throat. "I've already told you everything, Miss Marple. I don't know anything about the murder." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowed in thought. "But you do know something, don't you, Mr. Fairchild?" Victor's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I've told you everything I know. Everything!" His voice rose, a slight panic creeping into his words. "I'm not the murderer. You have no right to accuse me like this." Miss Marple observed him with the keenest of eyes, watching as his usual composure began to crack under the pressure. His anger was a response to something deeper, something she had yet to uncover. She smiled faintly to herself, recognizing the subtle tremor in his voice, the crack in his carefully constructed façade. "I'm not accusing you, Mr. Fairchild," she said in a measured tone. "I simply wanted to see how you would respond." Victor took a deep, shaky breath, trying to regain control of himself. "I told you the truth. You have to believe me." Miss Marple's smile remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. "I do believe you, but I think there's something you're not telling me." She paused for a moment, watching his reaction carefully. "What did you know about John Dunwich before your aunt's death? What kind of man was he to you?" The question hit its mark. Victor's eyes flashed, a mixture of anger and fear crossing his face. His hands trembled again, but this time he didn't try to hide it. His eyes darted to the door, as though considering an escape. "I've already told you," Victor muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "He was, nothing to me. Just a name from my family's past. I didn't even know he was involved with my aunt until all this started." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft yet probing. "But you must have known something. People don't simply return from the past without reason, and I believe you knew exactly why he was here." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "I don't know anything about that. You don't understand. You don't know what it was like. She kept things from me. She kept everything from me." His breath quickened, and his eyes grew wild. "I was never part of her plans, never part of anything." It was in that moment that Miss Marple knew she had found the crack she had been waiting for. The moment Victor's voice had broken, the moment his carefully controlled façade had shattered, she knew the truth was close. It wasn't just his own feelings of being left out that had him so upset. It was the guilt. The knowledge that Dunwich's reappearance had thrown a wrench into his plans to secure what he believed should be rightfully his. "Tell me, Mr. Fairchild," Miss Marple asked, her voice still steady, "when did you last speak to your aunt before her death?" Victor hesitated, his eyes flickering as though trying to remember something. I don't remember. It was the day before it happened. She had just finished dinner, and I asked her if I could look over some of the papers in her office. I wanted to make sure everything was in order, you know. But she wouldn't let me in. She said she had already made her decisions. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. "And you thought that was the end of it?" Victor, clearly unsettled now, glanced away. "What are you getting at? I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no humour in it. "No, Mr. Fairchild, you didn't kill her. But you knew about the danger. You knew about Dunwich's reappearance, didn't you?" Victor's face paled as the truth finally began to sink in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Out. The reality of his involvement, his silence in the face of the danger his aunt had been in, hung heavy in the room. Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat, her eyes never leaving Victor's. "You may not have been the murderer, but you allowed it to happen. And now it's time for you to make it right." For a long moment, Victor didn't move, his eyes locked on hers. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the weight of his own guilt settled over him, breaking the last of his resistance. The next few days were filled with a flurry of activity. Miss Marple's deductions had unsettled everyone in the household, and as the pieces of the puzzle continued to come together, the tension only grew. Victor Fairchild seemed to retreat further into himself, his earlier outbursts still echoing in the corners of his mind. He avoided most conversations, preferring the solitude of his study to the watchful eyes of others. Graves, too, seemed distracted, his mind wrestling with the emerging truths, but unable to connect the final dots. Meanwhile, Miss Marple remained observant, moving through the estate with a quiet precision, as though waiting for the last revelation to present itself. But the calm before the storm shattered late one evening. It was a bitter, cold night when the theft, or rather the disappearance, occurred. The case had reached a point where the truth seemed almost tangible, hanging in the air like a fine mist, just waiting to be captured. The critical evidence that could have linked John Dunwich to the murder, Lady Fairchild's handwritten notes about her will, had been carefully gathered and set aside for examination. Miss Marple had insisted that the final step in understanding the motive lay within those very notes, the secrets they contained revealing the true nature of the family's financial entanglements. With each passing moment, the notes became more vital, their importance exponentially growing. Miss Marple had asked for the documents to be kept safe under lock and key in a small chest in the library, a decision that should have ensured their security. And yet, when Miss Marple returned to the room the following morning, her heart sank. The chest was open. The notes were gone. Vanished. At first it seemed like a simple oversight. Perhaps Graves had moved them, or Victor, in some state of anxiety, had taken them for himself. But as she stepped closer to the desk, Miss Marple saw the subtle signs of something far more deliberate. The papers weren't just missing, they had been taken with precision, as though someone had known exactly what they were after. The other papers, including some innocuous documents, remained untouched, scattered across the desk. But the critical ones, the ones with Lady Fairchild's annotations, were gone. Miss Marple took a steadying breath, her mind racing. Someone had gotten to them first, and it wasn't just a matter of them being misplaced. No, someone had deliberately removed those notes to bury the truth before it could come to light. This was a setback, but she refused to be discouraged. The case wasn't lost, not yet. The first person she sought out was Graves. She found him in the drawing room, his eyes strained as though the pressure of the case was beginning to crack his usually steady composure. "Inspector," she greeted him, her voice calm despite the urgency that churned within her. "I need you to come with me." Graves looked up, his brow furrowing. "What's happened now, Miss Marple? Another lead gone cold?" "Not cold. Just gone," she replied, her tone laced with frustration. "Someone has taken the notes, the very documents that could have provided the answers we need. They're gone, vanished." For a moment, Graves said nothing. His eyes darted to the door as though considering whether to call for reinforcements, but he steadied himself. "Are you sure? The library is locked, and I've been keeping an eye on everything. Are you certain the chest was locked?" Miss Marple's gaze softened with understanding, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "I am certain. Inspector, I was the one who locked it last night." Graves didn't reply immediately, his eyes narrowing as he walked past her toward the library. He opened the door and scanned the room quickly, his instincts already at work. It didn't take long for him to confirm that Miss Marple wasn't mistaken. The chest was ajar, and the papers that had once been inside it were no longer there. "This doesn't make sense," Graves muttered, running a hand over his face. "Who could have done this?" Miss Marple's expression was unreadable as she stared at the empty chest. "Someone who knows exactly how close we are to the truth," she said softly. "Someone who is working against us." Graves's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think someone here is involved?" "I do," Miss Marple replied. "And I think they're getting desperate." The atmosphere in the house had shifted. The walls themselves seemed to close in, as though the house had become a cage for the truth, an ominous reminder that someone within its confines was willing to go to extreme lengths to hide it. Trust, so delicately built between the various parties, was now fraying at the edges. No one was above suspicion. Victor, who had remained distant since the revelations of his involvement in the family's past, was the next to be questioned. Miss Marple found him in his study, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a look of palpable nervousness. He straightened as she entered, but there was no mistaking the unease in his posture. "Miss Marple," he greeted her stiffly, his voice guarded. "Is there something more you need from me?" "We need to talk, Mr. Fairchild," Miss Marple said, her voice steady but insistent. "About the documents. They've been taken." Victor's eyes flickered, the slightest sign of recognition crossing his face. But just as quickly, his expression returned to its familiar mask. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I haven't touched anything." Miss Marple studied him carefully. His words were rehearsed, his body language betraying him. A slight tremor in his hands, the subtle shift in his gaze. "Mr. Fairchild," she continued, "someone has stolen the notes, the very ones that could have implicated John Dunwich. They're gone." Victor took a sharp breath, his hands gripping the edge of the desk in front of him. "I don't know anything about it, Miss Marple. I swear it." His voice wavered, the nervousness creeping into his tone despite his best efforts to remain composed. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, allowing the silence to hang in the air, thick with unspoken words. She could see it now. The cracks in his façade, the guilt, the desperation. "You're lying, Mr. Fairchild," she said softly. "You know who took those papers." Victor's eyes widened, and for the first time he faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. In that split second, Miss Marple saw it, the flicker of realization, the understanding that his actions had been exposed. The silence stretched between them, a taut string ready to snap. "I'll find the answers, Mr. Fairchild," Miss Marple added quietly. "And when I do, we'll see whether you were the one who had them destroyed, or whether someone else has been manipulating you." Victor's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of the moment bore down on him. The game was no longer just about finding the truth. It was about deciding who would be left standing when the final pieces of the mystery fell into place. The night air was heavy, almost oppressive, as Miss Marple made her way back to the library after her confrontation with Victor. She knew the walls were closing in on him. She had seen the signs, heard the tremor in his voice. But there was something deeper, something hidden beneath his words, that had yet to be fully revealed. As she crossed the hallway, her mind raced, piecing together the remaining fragments of the puzzle. But then came the scream. It pierced the stillness of the house, sharp and full of raw terror echoing down the corridors. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, her senses heightening as she immediately recognized the sound. It wasn't the scream of someone startled by a noise. It was the scream of someone in absolute fear. Without a second thought, she rushed toward the source of the scream. The sound had come from the direction of the east wing, the area of the house that was still largely untouched by renovations. Her footsteps quickened as she turned the corner, her hand gripping the banister for support. The hallway ahead of her was dark, but she could already make out the shadows of people huddled outside a door at the far end. By the time she arrived, Inspector Graves was already there, his hand on the doorframe, his face drawn tight with disbelief. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a grim nod, his voice low. "I don't think you're going to like what you're about to see." The door was open just a crack, and through the narrow gap, Miss Marple saw it. Victor Fairchild, his face twisted in horror, was crumpled on the floor, his eyes wide and unblinking. The bloodstains on his shirt told the grim story before anything else could. It was a scene so chilling it seemed to freeze the air around her. A second murder. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. Victor was not alone. His body was positioned oddly, as though he had collapsed from a single, precise blow. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing that suggested a violent altercation. Instead, the quiet, controlled nature of the crime suggested that the murderer had known exactly what they were doing. "Who found him?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. "His butler," Graves replied, his eyes still focused on the body. "He came to deliver breakfast, but when he found the door ajar, he called for help. By the time anyone got here, it was already too late. Did anyone hear anything? Any noises?" Miss Marple continued. Graves shook his head. "No, not a sound. It's as if whoever did this knew exactly when to strike." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Victor's body. The way he had been positioned, the unnatural twist of his arm, the deep gash in his side. It was clear to her that the murder had been well planned. And it wasn't just a crime of opportunity. This was a message. But who was it meant for? She crouched beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. Victor's expression was still frozen in terror, his lips parted in a silent scream. But it was his eyes, wide and searching, that held the key to what had happened. They weren't the eyes of a man surprised by an intruder. No, they were the eyes of someone who had seen something that made him realize the full scope of the danger he was in. A realization hit her with sudden clarity. Victor had known something he hadn't revealed, and that knowledge had sealed his fate. "Is there any sign of forced entry?" Miss Marple asked, still lost in thought. "No," Graves replied, shaking his head. "The door was unlocked. But there's no indication of anyone entering through the windows either. Everything appears undisturbed." Miss Marple stood, her eyes scanning the room once more. The room was nearly immaculate, save for the body and the trail of blood. There were no signs of a struggle, no objects overturned, no broken glass or shattered furniture, just the body, crumpled in the middle of the room. As Miss Marple's mind whirred, a quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Miss Marple turned to see Victor's butler standing in the doorway, his face pale and stricken with shock. His eyes darted nervously, avoiding the body, but he seemed to be searching for something, anything to explain the horrific scene before them. I don't understand, Miss Marple," the butler stammered. "I went to check on Mr. Fairchild this morning, just like I always do. And when I came in, I found him like that." He gulped, his hands trembling. Who would do such a thing? Miss Marple's gaze softened, her mind already leaping ahead. "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Mr. Fairchild? Anyone who might have had a reason to attack him?" The butler looked down, a flicker of unease crossing his face. I'm not sure. There are plenty of people who wouldn't be happy with Mr. Fairchild, especially with the way things have been around here lately. But I don't—" He was cut off by a sudden noise. From the corner of the room, a soft shuffle of footsteps was heard. Miss Marple turned sharply to find a shadow looming in the doorway. It was Victor's cousin, Lady Fairchild, her face pale and drawn as she stepped into the room. She looked at the body for a moment, her eyes wide but unreadable, before her gaze shifted to Miss Marple. "Did you find him?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Eleanor. "Yes. It seems someone has acted before we could solve the case." Eleanor's face betrayed nothing, but the tension in her posture was palpable. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought this would happen." "But you knew about the danger, didn't?" "You?" Miss Marple asked, her voice sharp but calm. Eleanor's gaze flickered for the briefest of moments, and in that fleeting instant, Miss Marple saw it. The subtle shift in her expression, the quiet admission that she knew more than she was letting on. But before Eleanor could respond, a sudden realization hit Miss Marple with the force of a thunderclap. The second murder was not just a continuation of the first. It was a clear sign that the villain, whoever they were, was not just trying to cover their tracks. They were still several steps ahead. The real danger was still lurking, and it was becoming clear that Victor's death wasn't the end of this twisted game. It was only the beginning. As the room filled with murmurs and questions, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward, piecing together the fragments of this new crime. It wasn't just about solving the murder, it was about preventing another one from happening before it was too late. The air in the Fairchild house felt thicker now, as if every room held its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Miss Marple had left the crime scene behind, but could not shake the feeling that she was being led towards something. The second murder, so calculated and so cruel, had left the authorities reeling, but Miss Marple saw it as a step forward. A dark, twisted step, but a step nonetheless. She had spent the remainder of the afternoon speaking with the household staff, trying to piece together the smallest fragments of conversation, actions and habits that might have eluded others. The police had made their rounds, taking statements, but Miss Marple understood how quickly the noise of panic could obscure the truth. It wasn't until dusk, as the estate seemed to settle into a quiet, eerie calm, that Miss Marple noticed something peculiar, something she had missed before. She was in the study, flipping through a ledger she had borrowed from the butler's desk, when her eyes fell on a small, innocuous detail. A note left on the desk by the late Victor Fairchild. The note wasn't new. It had been there for days, untouched. But Miss Marple's mind was sharper now, her instincts on alert. She had seen similar notes before, but they hadn't stood out to her. She had been too distracted by the murder, the tension of the house, the mounting pressure. Yet now it clicked. The note was hastily written in Victor's hand. No formalities, no proper punctuation. It wasn't a letter or a message. It was more like a reminder, a checklist, a thought scribbled in haste. Look at the hands. It's the only way to find it. Look at the hands, Miss Marple muttered aloud to herself, a cold shiver crawling up her spine. She read it again, this time with more attention. It had felt like a cryptic message at first, but now it seemed to suggest something far more specific. Hands. The clue had always been right there, hidden in plain sight. Victor Fairchild had made a mistake. In trying to understand the bigger picture, he had overlooked something simple, a detail that had been so close, so obvious, that it had slipped under everyone's radar. It was a pattern, Miss Marple realized, a pattern emerging from a series of scattered moments. Miss Marple. She looked up, startled from her thoughts. Eleanor Fairchild stood in the doorway, her face weary, eyes swollen from crying. Her usual composure was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that Miss Marple had not seen before. It wasn't just grief that wore her down now. It was fear, real fear. Did you find something? Eleanor asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Miss Marple stood up slowly, placing the note down with deliberate care. Yes, Eleanor, I think I may have. Eleanor stepped inside the room, her gaze flicking nervously around the space, before landing on the desk where the note lay. I don't understand. What's it mean? What do you think Victor was trying to tell us? Miss Marple paused, her fingers grazing the edge of the note as she considered the woman before her. Eleanor's hands were trembling ever so slightly, but it was her eyes, the panic within them, that struck Miss Marple most. He was telling us to pay attention to the hands, Miss Marple replied, her voice low and firm. Eleanor frowned, confused. The hands, what do you mean? People, when they hold something, when they move, when they touch things, they give something away. It's a subtle gesture, but one that often betrays intent. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Victor had started to piece it together. I think he was on the verge of something important when he was killed. But what does this have to do with the murders? Eleanor pressed, her voice tightening. What are you saying, Miss Marple? Miss Marple hesitated, then took a step toward the fireplace, her gaze lingering on the family portraits hanging on the walls. "The first murder, Eleanor, your uncle's death. It wasn't random, and neither was Victor's." She turned back to face Eleanor, a quiet intensity in her eyes. "I believe they were both killed because they knew too much." Eleanor took a step back, her breath quickening. But how? What could they have known?" "The hands, Eleanor," Miss Marple said softly. "The murderer's hands, their actions. It's not just the victim that reveals their death, but the killer's movements. They leave a trail. And if we look at those movements, if we observe the hands closely enough, we'll know exactly who we're looking for." Eleanor's face grew pale, the color draining from her cheeks. "Are you suggesting that someone in this house—" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I am. And I think we've all overlooked something that's been right in front of us." As Eleanor digested the information, a sudden thought struck Miss Marple, a nagging suspicion she couldn't yet place. She moved swiftly toward the bookshelf at the far end of the room, her fingers tracing the spines of the books in a quick, almost absent-minded motion. Her eyes flitted between the titles until they landed on one in particular, a small, unassuming volume tucked away near the back. "The Secrets of the Fairchild Estate. A history of the family. A record of events stretching back generations." Miss Marple had noticed it earlier, but now it seemed important. She pulled it out and flipped it open, scanning the pages until she reached a section about the family's inheritance, the one that had been a source of constant tension between Victor and his relatives. The book described an old legend, a story of a hidden fortune buried deep beneath the Fairchild estate, hidden by generations of Fairchilds, meant only for the rightful heir. But there was more to it than just treasure. The final passage read, "Only the hands that have touched the truth will find the key. Beware the hands that seek the hidden things, for they have already been tainted." Miss Marple's mind snapped into focus as the pieces fell into place. The pattern wasn't just in the victims or the motives, it was in the hands. And now she knew what she had to do. She turned to Eleanor, her expression resolute. "I need to see the Fairchild family ring." Eleanor blinked, startled. "The family ring? Why?" "The key to everything lies with the hands, Eleanor," Miss Marple said calmly. "And I think the one person who holds the answer has been hiding in plain sight." Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, before she quickly nodded. "I'll get it. You'll find the truth, won't you, Miss Marple?" "I already have, Miss A," Marple replied, her gaze hardening with conviction. The answer had been right there all along, tucked into the corners of the house, in the motions and secrets of the family. And now, finally, Miss Marple knew exactly who the murderer was. Eleanor returned a few moments later, holding a small velvet pouch in her trembling hands. She looked at Miss Marple with uncertainty, her eyes wide and searching for any hint of what had been uncovered. "Here it is," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely a whisper, as if the weight of the family's secret could crush her with every word. Miss Marple took the pouch gently, as though it contained something fragile and irreplaceable. She untied the string, allowing the contents to spill into her palm. The family ring gleamed in the dim light of the study, an ornate piece with intricate engravings. Its emerald stone sparkled faintly, almost mockingly, as though it knew it was about to reveal more than any of them had anticipated. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, holding the ring up to the light, her eyes narrowing as she studied the fine details. She had no particular interest in the precious stone or the craftsmanship, but something about the ring called to her attention. The engraving around the band was the key. It was subtle, easy to overlook, but Miss Marple's sharp eye never missed the details. "It's the same as the inscription in the book," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "The key. The truth is hidden, but it's always been here." Eleanor, confused, stepped closer. "What are you talking about? What truth?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She stood up and turned to face Eleanor, her gaze piercing. "The truth, Eleanor, is that you've been hiding in plain sight. The ring, the family legend, it's all been designed to protect you, but not from the truth about the inheritance, as you might have believed." Eleanor froze, her breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I don't understand." Miss Marple's voice softened, yet it carried the weight of certainty. "The murder of your Uncle Victor and the death of your husband, that was never about money, was it?" She let the words hang in the air, her eyes watching Eleanor carefully, almost studying her. Eleanor's face drained of colour. "No, it wasn't about money," she stammered, her voice shaking. "But if not money, then what? What are you saying?" The detective allowed the silence to settle, a quiet pause as she let Eleanor's mind grapple with the implications. Then she spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "It was about control," Miss Marple said. "You've been trying to protect something much more precious than gold or land, haven't you, Eleanor? You've been trying to protect the one thing that could ruin everything, your own secret." Eleanor's eyes widened, panic creeping into her expression. She took a step back, almost knocking into the edge of the desk. What secret?" Miss Marple held up the ring, letting the light catch its surface, as if it were a magnifying glass on Eleanor's soul. This ring was never just a family heirloom. It wasn't just a symbol of wealth or legacy. It was the key to something more. It's the key to the truth behind the Fairchild's history, your history, Eleanor. Eleanor's lips parted, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her mouth. "You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying." Miss Marple interrupted, her voice unwavering. "You've been hiding a secret, Eleanor, one that no one has ever known about until now." Eleanor sank into a chair, her face pale and drawn, as though the weight of the world had suddenly descended upon her shoulders. Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "Please, you don't understand." "Then help me understand, Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently, sitting across from her, her gaze unrelenting. "I know you were desperate to protect your family legacy, but not like this. Not at the cost of innocent lives. Why would you do it?" Eleanor trembled, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want anyone to know about what happened between me and Victor. It was the only way to keep it all hidden. He threatened to expose me, and I couldn't let him. I couldn't let the family find out the truth about me." Miss Marple leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What truth? What happened between you and Victor?" Eleanor's breath hitched as she looked at the detective, the walls around her collapsing. "Victor wasn't just my uncle. He was my lover." The words landed like a blow, but Miss Marple did not flinch. She had suspected something, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through the room. Eleanor's voice cracked as she continued. We were involved when I was younger. But it was supposed to be a secret. We knew what would happen if anyone found out. The shame, the scandal, the ruin it would bring to the family. And I thought I could bury it, forget it. But then Victor, he found out something I couldn't allow anyone to know. Victor knew. Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing as the puzzle pieces slid into place. Eleanor nodded, her face buried in her hands. He found the old letters, the ones we wrote to each other. He said he would ruin me, expose everything. He even threatened to use it against me if I didn't give him access to the family's wealth. But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted more. He wanted control. He thought he could take it all. And that's when you killed him, Miss Marple said softly, not as a question, but as a matter of fact. Eleanor's head shot up, her face a mask of horror and guilt. No, I didn't kill him, but I... She paused, then looked at Miss Marple with despair. I didn't kill him directly, but I had him killed. I paid someone. I didn't want to, but I couldn't let him destroy me. I couldn't let him ruin my family, my reputation. So I hired someone to make it look like an accident. Miss Marple took in the confession with a heavy silence. The complex web of guilt, fear, and shame had finally revealed its true shape. And then the second murder, Miss Marple continued, her voice even. Your husband. He knew something, didn't he? He was getting too close to the truth, wasn't he? Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears, and her body shook with a silent sob. Yes, she whispered. He knew. He had started asking questions, and then he found something. Something about Victor and me. He confronted me. He wanted to go to the police. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't. You killed him too, Miss Marple said, her voice calm, but there was an edge of sorrow in it now. Eleanor nodded, her tears falling freely. I had no choice. I couldn't let it all come out. I couldn't let the truth ruin everything. The room felt colder now, the weight of the confession hanging heavy in the air. Miss Marple stood up, slowly placing the ring back on the desk, her expression somber. You were willing to sacrifice everything, Miss Marple said quietly, to protect a secret that was already buried. But in doing so, you've exposed yourself in the worst way imaginable. It was never just about power or money, Eleanor. It was about fear. Fear of losing everything you had worked to build, even if it meant destroying those around you. Eleanor stared blankly ahead, lost in her own grief and regret. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered. I didn't know what else to do. Miss Marple paused at the door, casting one last look at the broken woman. You may not have known what you were doing, Eleanor, but now you will face the consequences of your actions. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deep you bury it. With that, Miss Marple turned, her steps soft as she left the room, leaving Eleanor to confront the magnitude of the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. The shadows in the study lengthened as Miss Marple stood at the window, looking out at the quiet estate. The storm that had battered the grounds for hours was finally beginning to subside, but the air still hung heavy with the scent of rain and the weight of unspoken truths. Eleanor's confession had revealed much, but Miss Marple knew there was still more to uncover, more to untangle before the final threads of the case could be woven together. Eleanor had gone into hiding, or perhaps she was simply trying to erase herself from the equation. The authorities had been alerted, and soon the law would descend on the Fairchild estate, But Miss Marple had one final step to take. She was certain, now more than ever, that the truth behind the murders and the hidden motive would only come to light once the last piece of the puzzle was placed. It was time to confront the last remaining person in the web of deception, Victor's widow, Margaret. Miss Marple turned from the window, her eyes narrowing with determination. Margaret had been too calm throughout the investigation, too collected, too certain that the storm would pass without touching her. The little cracks that had appeared in her alibi were enough to make Miss Marple suspicious. The woman who had appeared to mourn her husband's death might have been the architect of it all, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. It wasn't just Eleanor's confession that had convinced Miss Marple of Margaret's involvement. It was the small details, the moments that didn't quite add up. The unspoken connections between Margaret and Eleanor, the way they had danced around the truth when asked about their relationship with Victor, the careful words that had slipped out, each one a small clue, a faint echo of guilt. Margaret had been watching her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But now it was Miss Marple's turn. The detective made her way through the labyrinth of corridors, each step deliberate, each movement calculated. She had set the stage for the final confrontation. All the pieces had fallen into place, and she knew that Margaret, in her arrogance, would underestimate her just as the others had. The door to the study was ajar, and the faint light from the hallway flickered across the floor, illuminating the scene of the final act. Margaret was sitting by the fire, her back to Miss Marple, as though she had been expecting her. When she turned, her face was composed, the familiar mask of the grieving widow in place, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a flicker of something deeper, something darker, lurking just beneath the surface. The detective had seen it before, the look of someone caught in a lie they were struggling to keep hidden. "I see you've come," Margaret said, her voice smooth, though there was a tremor beneath the calm. "I knew it wouldn't take long for you to find me." Miss Marple smiled, the faintest curl of her lips, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been waiting for this moment, Margaret. It's time we talked." The widow's eyes narrowed, but she did not rise. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, as though she were waiting for the inevitable. "What more is there to say, Miss Marple? I've already told you everything you need to know. My husband was murdered, and I was left to pick up the pieces. It's a tragedy, nothing more." "A tragedy," Miss Marple repeated softly, walking toward the center of the room. "But there's something more to it than that, isn't there? Something deeper. Something you've been hiding." Margaret's eyes flashed. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You can pretend all you like, but the truth is undeniable. You've been manipulating everyone around you, Margaret, pulling strings from behind the scenes. I know you were involved in your husband's death, but that wasn't your only crime, was it?" The widow's face hardened, but she remained silent. Miss Marple continued, her voice cool but filled with certainty. "You didn't just want Victor dead. You wanted to protect something much more valuable than money, something you couldn't afford to lose. You've been hiding in plain sight, letting everyone think you were just a grieving widow. But I know the truth." Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her movements calculated. "I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. Your assumptions are nothing more than that, assumptions. You're grasping at straws." Miss Marple stepped closer, her presence unyielding. "You had a motive, Margaret, A strong one, but it wasn't just about Victor. You've been hiding something far more personal, something you've been running from your entire life. It's the reason you killed him and the reason you've tried so hard to cover it all up. You were willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to keep it hidden. Margaret's eyes flickered. A brief moment of hesitation. The mask was cracking. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "You think you do, but you don't understand. You never will." "Oh, I understand more than you think," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and steady. "I know what you've been trying to protect. I know about the affair. I know that Victor wasn't just your husband, Margaret. He was your accomplice in a far darker scheme. A scheme that involved more than just one death." Margaret's breath hitched. Her eyes darted around the room, and for a moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of panic. It was all too much for her. The detective had finally cornered her, laid bare the truth she had worked so hard to bury. You don't know what you're talking about," Margaret stammered, her composure unraveling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. But Victor, he wouldn't listen. He wanted to ruin everything, to expose me, to what, Margaret?" Miss Marple interjected. "To destroy you? To take what you had? He was your partner in crime, wasn't he? You two were in it together, plotting from the very beginning. You were just as guilty as he was." Margaret stepped back, her eyes widening with terror. No, it wasn't supposed to be like this." Miss Marple took another step forward, the tension in the room palpable. "But it was like this. You killed Victor, just as you killed your husband, all in the name of protecting your secret. But secrets have a way of surfacing, Margaret. They always do." Margaret looked desperate now, her composure completely shattered. "You think you know everything, but you don't. I did what I had to do. I had no choice." "You had a choice," Miss Marple said softly, "but you chose the path that led to destruction." Suddenly, the door to the study creaked open, and two uniformed officers entered. Margaret turned toward them with a look of disbelief, her body stiffening as she realized the trap had been sprung. There was no escape now. "Margaret Fairchild," one of the officers said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for the murders of Victor and your husband. The evidence is overwhelming. You've been caught in your own web of lies." Margaret's face twisted with a mixture of rage and fear, but she did not resist. The game was over. She had been outmaneuvered, undone by her own arrogance, by the very secrets she had tried so desperately to protect. As the officers moved to cuff her, Miss Marple stood quietly by the fire, watching the scene unfold. The tension that had gripped the estate for so long was finally dissipating, but it had come at a heavy cost. The last piece of the puzzle had been placed, and the truth, though painful, had triumphed over the darkness. Margaret Fairchild was led away, her fate sealed, and the mystery was finally resolved. But for Miss Marple, the work was never truly over. There were always more puzzles, more hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. And as she watched the officers escort the villain from the room, she knew she would be ready for the next one, Miss Marple watched Margaret Fairchild being escorted out of the room. A strange unease settled over her. The case had been solved, or so it seemed. The web of deception that had ensnared so many had finally been unraveled, and the true culprit stood before the officers, her fate sealed. Yet, something lingered in the air, something elusive, just out of reach. The officers took Margaret away, and the house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as if the oppressive tension that had plagued it for so long was finally dissipating. But Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what had unfolded. The truth, in her experience, was often a slippery thing, and even the most straightforward of cases could hide layers of complexity waiting to be uncovered. She lingered in the study, her thoughts running over the details once more. She turned to the desk, her fingers lightly brushing over the papers strewn across the surface. The momentary stillness of the room seemed to beckon her, almost as though the walls themselves were urging her to look deeper, to consider every possibility. It was then that she noticed it, a small detail that had slipped past her during the investigation. A letter, half hidden beneath a pile of old correspondence. She picked it up carefully, her brow furrowing as she read its contents. The handwriting was familiar, but it didn't belong to Margaret Fairchild. It was a letter from Victor Fairchild, written just days before his death. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read the words. It wasn't the content of the letter that struck her, but the final line, a cryptic message that made no sense in the context of what she had believed to be true. I know what you're planning, and I'm not afraid. I've already made arrangements. It's not too late for us to turn things around. The letter was addressed to someone named J. The initials were unfamiliar to Miss Marple, and the reference to arrangements left her unsettled. The idea that Victor had been aware of a plot, something beyond what they had all assumed, sent a shiver down her spine. She had thought the murder was simply a matter of greed and revenge, but this letter suggested a far more intricate scheme. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place in a way that Miss Marple had not anticipated. Margaret's involvement seemed like the obvious answer. She had been the grieving widow after all, the one with the most to gain. But now she was not so sure. What if Margaret had been just a pawn in a much larger game? What if the true mastermind had been operating from the shadows all along, playing everyone, including Miss Marple, like a fiddle? The more she thought about it, the more her doubts grew. Margaret had been far too composed, far too calm throughout the investigation. The confession had been almost too easy, and the evidence against her seemed too clean. Miss Marple had always trusted her instincts, and right now they were telling her that the final act of the play had not yet been revealed. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. There was one person who might hold the key to this new mystery, someone who had been too quiet, too eager to stay out of the spotlight, a person who had stayed on the periphery, waiting for the dust to settle before making their move. The butler, Mr. Graves. Miss Marple made her way to the hallway, her steps purposeful. Graves had been in the house longer than anyone, and though he had remained largely unnoticed during the investigation, he had been present for every critical moment. He knew the estate better than anyone, had access to places no one else could reach, and had an uncanny ability to stay out of the way when the attention was focused elsewhere. When Miss Marple found him, he was standing in the servants' quarters, his back turned as he arranged some items on a shelf. He didn't turn when she entered, but there was something in the way his shoulders stiffened at her arrival that caught her attention. "Mr. Graves," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I believe we need to have a word." He turned slowly, his face unreadable. "Of course, Miss Marple. What can I assist you with?" She studied him for a moment, weighing her words carefully. "It's about the letter I just found, Victor's letter. The one addressed to J." Graves' face tightened ever so slightly, his hands betraying a hint of nervousness as he smoothed the front of his uniform. "I'm not sure I follow, Miss Marple." "Oh, I think you do." Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she watched for any sign of a reaction. "You've been very quiet during the entire investigation, Mr. Graves. Almost too quiet. And yet, you've been here through it all. You knew exactly what was happening in this house long before the rest of us." Graves's mouth tightened into a thin line. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I've simply done my duty. I have no interest in the affairs of the family." Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice low but firm. "You see, I've been thinking about this case long and hard, and something doesn't add up. Margaret wasn't the mastermind. She was only a part of the puzzle. But you knew more, didn't you? You were the one who really had control, the one pulling the strings from the shadows." For a long moment, Graves didn't move. The air between them was thick with tension. Finally, he let out a slow, resigned sigh and dropped his eyes. "You're right, Miss Marple. I wasn't just the butler. I was involved. I had to be. There was no other way." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Involved in what exactly?" Graves looked up at her, his eyes hollow with regret. "I was Victor's partner in more ways than one. We had plans, you see, big plans. But when he started to back out, when he realized the cost of our actions, I had no choice but to act." "The letter," Miss Marple began, her voice trailing off as she pieced together the confession. He nodded, his voice thick with guilt. "Yes. It was supposed to be a warning, a last-ditch effort to stop what was coming. But by then, it was too late. Margaret didn't know everything. She thought she was in control, but I had already made arrangements. I knew how to cover my tracks. I thought I could get away with it. But you..." He looked at her, his expression twisting. "You saw through me." Miss Marple took a deep breath, her mind racing as the truth unfolded before her. The entire case had been a tangled web of manipulation and deceit, but it was Graves who had been the true orchestrator. Margaret had been a tool, a distraction, and even Victor had been caught in the snare of his own making. "I'm afraid your plans have unraveled, Mr. Graves," Miss Marple said quietly, as she turned toward the door. He made no attempt to stop her. His fate, like that of so many before him, was sealed. The true mastermind had been right in front of her all along, hidden in plain sight. And now, the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. As Miss Marple exited the room, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow. It was always the quiet ones, the ones who blended into the background, who turned out to be the most dangerous. She had solved the case, but at what cost? The innocent were never truly innocent, and the guilty were never as they seemed. The storm had passed, but the truth had left its mark, and Miss Marple knew that there would always be another puzzle waiting for her, just around the corner. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching the heavy rain continue to lash against the glass. The storm that had raged over the house had finally passed, but its after-effects lingered in the oppressive silence that filled the room. The case was, by all outward appearances, over. Margaret was in custody, Graves was exposed for his manipulations, and yet Miss Marple felt no satisfaction. Instead, there was an unsettling stillness, a nagging feeling that all the pieces had not yet fallen into place. Graves had confessed, but his explanation had been far too easy. It had fit the pieces together, yes, but something about his confession rang hollow. Miss Marple had heard it before, the confession of a guilty man who didn't know how to cover all his tracks. She had watched Graves carefully during their conversation, and though his guilt had been undeniable, there was something about his demeanor that bothered her. As the rain battered the windows, her mind began to drift through the final hours of the investigation. Graves had been too calm in the face of the truth, too ready to spill the details of his involvement. There was a certain resignation in his eyes, but also a glimmer of something else. Fear, or perhaps satisfaction. But fear of what? What had he been truly afraid of? She turned to face the others in the room, the officers and detectives who had been swept up in the tide of events. They had all assumed the case was solved, that the puzzle was finished. Yet Miss Marple knew that the pieces of the puzzle were like shifting sands, always moving, always changing, never quite solid. There was something more to the story, something that the others had missed. "Miss Marple," Inspector Jones said, breaking the silence. "It seems we've finally caught him." Graves confessed. "The rest of the suspects are cleared. Justice will be served." She didn't respond immediately, her gaze still fixed on the window. The rain had slowed, but the sky remained heavy, with the promise of more. She turned to face the inspector, her sharp eyes betraying nothing of the thoughts swirling in her mind. "Yes," she said slowly, "but I wonder if justice is truly served." The inspector's brow furrowed in confusion. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple," Graves confessed. "Yes. But something doesn't sit right with me. I've been going over everything in my mind, and I believe there's something we missed. A detail that escaped our attention." The room fell silent as the officers exchanged uncertain glances. Miss Marple took a deep breath, her fingers drumming softly on the side of the chair. "You see, I believe Graves wasn't the only one involved in Victor's death. He was only part of the story, a piece of the puzzle. But there's someone else, someone we've overlooked." Inspector Jones looked at her, his face unreadable. "Miss Marple, Graves was the one who arranged everything. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, that's what you've been told, but that doesn't make it the truth." "Then who are you suggesting?" The inspector's voice had a slight edge to it now, a touch of defensiveness. "I believe Graves was acting under someone else's orders. Someone who orchestrated everything from the shadows. Someone who never had to lift a finger, but was always in control." There was a long pause as everyone in the room absorbed her words. The tension was palpable, the weight of her statement hanging in the air like a thick fog. The inspector stared at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand what she was implying. "So, you believe there's another mastermind? Someone else who pulled the strings?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, someone who has been hiding in plain sight all along. Someone who made sure they were never the center of attention, but who had the most to gain from Victor's death." She could see the moment the realization began to dawn in the inspector's eyes. It was a slow process, like the creeping light of dawn breaking through the darkness. His expression shifted from one of disbelief to understanding. "Are you suggesting? Could it really be?" Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "The one person who stood to inherit everything, who had the most reason to silence Victor, was none other than his sister, Beatrice." The room went silent again, the tension thickening. The officers exchanged glances, uncertainty rippling through them. Miss Marple could see their doubts, but she stood firm. Graves was a pawn. Beatrice was the true mastermind. The inspector shook his head slowly, as if trying to push the thought away. But Beatrice, she was the one who seemed so distraught. She's been the most cooperative of all the family members. Exactly, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but insistent. It's all too perfect, too convenient. Beatrice played the part of the grieving sister, the one who was so desperate to solve the crime, to help in any way she could. But behind that mask, she was plotting her brother's death from the very beginning. She knew that the inheritance would go to her if Victor died, and she manipulated everything, right down to the smallest detail. But why Graves? Why involve him? The inspector's voice was filled with frustration. If Beatrice was the mastermind, why not just do it herself? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Because she knew that Graves was the perfect scapegoat. She needed someone who could be easily controlled, someone who had access to the household, someone who could carry out her plan without raising suspicion. And Graves was just that. Too loyal, too eager to please. All she had to do was plant the seed of doubt, and he did the rest. The inspector's face softened with realization. And the letter? The one we thought was from Victor? Miss Marple nodded. It was a clever ruse. Beatrice knew that Graves would find it and believe it was a confession. She used it to manipulate him further, pushing him to act in ways that would incriminate him, all while staying in the background, appearing innocent. The officers stood in stunned silence, unable to process the full extent of what Miss Marple was saying. The walls of the room seemed to close in as they grappled with the idea that everything they had worked so hard to piece together was now a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. But then, just as quickly, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next question. And now, we must find her. We must make sure that justice is truly served. As she spoke, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a sense of impending movement. Beatrice, the true mastermind, had been slipping through their fingers the entire time. She had played them all, weaving a web of deception that now threatened to collapse in on itself. But was it too late? Was she already too far ahead, ready to vanish once again into the shadows from which she had come? Miss Marple took one last look at the storm outside, her mind racing. The case had not been solved, not yet. And until Beatrice was caught, justice would remain an elusive dream. The final twist had been revealed. But the chase for the true villain had only just begun. The rain had ceased, but the clouds remained heavy and oppressive, casting a grey pallor over the estate. The evening air felt cooler than it should, a chill that seemed to permeate even the warmest of rooms. Miss Marple, having uncovered the truth of Beatrice's role in her brother's death, now stood alone on the doorstep, the distant hum of the investigation still swirling in the background. The officers had gone, the scene had been cleared, and yet she could not shake the feeling that something more lingered, something just beyond reach. She had confronted Beatrice, of course, and the shock in the woman's eyes when the truth was revealed was unmistakable. There had been no dramatic confession, no grand reveal. Instead, Beatrice had simply collapsed under the weight of her own guilt, her eyes filled with quiet defeat. The case, in many ways, had come to its natural end, but Miss Marple's mind continued to turn, restless, her thoughts racing ahead to the next step, the next puzzle. As the officers drove off and the last traces of their presence faded from view, Miss Marple took a slow, deliberate walk through the garden. It was a path she had often taken during her visits, though today it felt different. Each step seemed to carry an added weight, the ground beneath her feet somehow more uncertain than before. She paused by the fountain, watching the water ripple in the fading light, and took a deep breath. She had solved the mystery, exposed the villain, and yet something about the resolution felt incomplete. Her gaze drifted over the lush grounds of the estate, where Victor had been found dead, where so many had been drawn into a web of lies and betrayal, and something caught her attention. There, half buried beneath a pile of leaves near the garden gate, was an object. It wasn't much, just the corner of a torn envelope, but it was enough to catch her trained eye. She bent down, brushing aside the leaves with a delicate hand, and pulled the object free. The envelope was old, worn, and clearly discarded, its edges frayed from the passage of time. Miss Marple turned it over, her fingers tracing the smudged ink on the front. There was no name, no address, just a single cryptic message. The truth is never as simple as it seems. A shiver ran through her, not from the cold, but from the subtle, growing realization that this wasn't just an old piece of correspondence. No, this was a clue, one that, like the others, had been hidden in plain sight all along. A whisper of a mystery she hadn't fully solved yet. The moment was fleeting, but Miss Marple could feel the familiar pull of a puzzle, a case that had not yet been closed in her mind. She tucked the envelope into the folds of her coat and continued her walk. There was still more to this story, that much was clear. Beatrice may have been the mastermind behind Victor's death, but Miss Marple's instincts told her there was a larger picture, a deeper connection, one that reached beyond the family, beyond the estate. The subtle hint in the envelope could not be ignored. By the time Miss Marple returned to her room in the house, she was already formulating the questions that had yet to be answered. The cryptic message in the envelope, its origins and meaning, were not the only mysteries that still tugged at her mind. She recalled the moments when Beatrice had broken under pressure, her gaze not entirely focused on the detective, as if there was someone else watching, pulling the strings from a distance. Could it be that Beatrice had not acted alone? Had someone else, someone unexpected, been behind the entire plot, using Beatrice as a pawn to carry out their plans? The idea seemed far-fetched, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss a theory without exploring it fully. There was always more beneath the surface. And then there was the question of Graves. Had he truly been manipulated? Or had he simply been too eager to please, too willing to take the fall for something that had gone terribly wrong? His confession had been too clean, too simple. It hadn't felt like a man caught in a lie, but rather one who had been given a script to follow. A convenient fall guy, perhaps, or someone who had simply outlived his usefulness. Miss Marple walked to the small writing desk in her room. The pile of notes she had gathered during the investigation spread before her. She picked up her pen, and as her fingers moved across the paper, the thoughts began to take shape. Every detail, every conversation, every fleeting expression, all of it was connected, but not in the way she had first assumed. The pieces were scattered, but they had yet to form the full picture. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned, not startled, but calm. It was Inspector Jones, his face drawn and weary from the long hours of the investigation. He stepped inside, his gaze lingering on Miss Marple with something like respect, though she could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I see you're still at it, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with a wry smile. "Haven't you had enough of this case?" Miss Marple returned his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "It's never enough, Inspector. A case isn't truly solved until every question is answered." He stepped closer, glancing down at the papers scattered across her desk. "You don't think we've got it all figured out?" She didn't respond right away, instead taking a moment to adjust the envelope she had found in the garden. "The truth rarely comes in neat little packages, Inspector. There's always more if you look closely enough." Jones paused, his eyes scanning the table once again. He sighed heavily, as if he too had felt the gnawing sense of unfinished business that Miss Marple had. "You're right," he said after a moment. "But I think the rest of the world will be content with the answers we've already found. The case is closed after all." "Is it?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "Perhaps in the eyes of the law, it is. But in my mind, there's a lingering question, a mystery yet to be solved." The inspector nodded, sensing the finality in her tone, but also the subtle undercurrent of doubt that had crept into their minds. He didn't press her further. Instead, he lingered for a moment longer, then turned to leave. "Miss Marple," he said, his hand on the door handle, "you know where to find me if you figure it out." She smiled softly, the corners of her eyes crinkling in a way that betrayed her amusement. "I always do, Inspector. I always do." As the door clicked shut behind him, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her eyes turning once more to the window. The storm had passed, the sky beginning to clear, but she knew the storm in her mind would not settle so easily. The mystery of Lady Fairchild's last will was just one thread in a larger tapestry, one that had yet to reveal its final design. And somewhere in the quiet corners of her thoughts, Miss Marple knew that the next mystery would not be far behind. A case never truly ends. It only gives way to the next, and she would be ready.